Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first in our very exciting series of Frank Davis Memorial Lectures. I do think we have to thank the late Frank Davis for bringing you all together, and just to say that surprisingly enough, in terms of the kinds of subjects we're going to be talking about, Frank Davis was a stalwart contributor to Country Life magazine, and wrote a book like Country Life, Book of Glass in 1966. Thank you, Frank Davis. But more to the point, we're welcoming our very distinguished inaugural lecturer, Madame Françoise Vergès, who's come over from Paris, especially to speak to us. And her title today is, as you know, Decolonizing the Museum. Françoise has published many books. You could look up her illustrious career, of course, online. I forgot to say welcome, of course, to our online audience today as well. And her latest enterprises are in 2020, Wombs, Women, Race, Capital, Feminism, and her conversations with the illustrious Aimé Césaire, one of the great founders of what at the time in France was called Négritude. And this is a very moving transgenerational encounter. Françoise, I'm so chagrined I could have met her so much earlier. She taught at the University of Sussex in 1996, and she was with us in London teaching at Goldsmiths College from 2000 to 2007. In 2008, and serving until 2012, she became president of the French National Society for the Memory and History of Slavery, which is of course very important and very topical today. I first encountered Françoise visually, if you like, in the film by the great artist Isaac Julien, with whom we were last night, one of his very first films called Fanon, about Frantz Fanon, the great Martinique writer who wrote Black Skin, White Masks, published in French in 1952. And it was very interesting because it flipped between the staging of Fanon's life and the present with people talking, like indeed Françoise. And we both were involved in another Black British artist, Yinka Shonibare's exhibition at the Musée du Quai Branly quite some time ago. Such a long time ago, I don't remember the year. Although I'm going to be lecturing, I think, about Yinka's installation a bit later in the term. Françoise has two very interesting projects to look forward to at present. Oh, I just forgot about your publication in 2021. It's written down here, Françoise. Maybe you'd like to remind me of its title.
It's coming out. There's the decolonial feminism.
Yes, decolonial feminism. Sorry, yes, of course. This is the great subject, of course. And how was I going to end? Yes, with your present topics, because Françoise was born and brought up in the Réunion Island, which is the furthest part of what the French do not like to call empire, next to Madagascar. And both her parents were very prominent activists who left their archives for the Union, and Françoise is going to make a film commemorating their life as a militant couple, with lots of add-ons, I think, as well as the idea of a very engaging film for the widest of audiences. And her other current project is to set up a platform for decolonial memories and archives on what you said to me, you described as a south-south axis. But I'm sure we're eager to hear what Françoise has to say to us. So Françoise, please take the floor for the Decolonizing the Museum talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. Okay, my talk will be in two parts. First, some remarks about the title. And then secondly, I will show some I will talk and show some pictures of decolonial practices in the museum that I have curated for some years now. I have a long interest in museums and the way in which they narrate things, history or painting or art. And for 10 years I worked on a project of a museum in Réunion Island, for which I suggested to build a museum without a project, and I will talk about it. But the project was killed in 2010, so there was no museum, nothing. But I will talk about it. So first about the title before I will go into some of the practices. I put the question mark because I mean to say, what is it possible? Is it possible to decolonize the museum? They are like in any institution, you have a culture with norms and transnormative practices. So, is it possible to decolonize the museum? The museum is a social body. It must be looked at it in its entirety, from bottom to top, asking who is cleaning in the museum, who are the guards, what is the process of, decision making? Do you have sexual violence, racial violence? Who set up the collection? Where does it come from? Is it enough even to change the text, or to add some artists to fill the gap, women or people of color, artists of color? That will be justice, just justice, but it will not be decolonization. So we can support effectively that movement of justice, but it's not quite decolonization. Decolonization is a much deeper process, and I draw from Césaire, Fanon, Sylvia Winter, and all about that. It's a long and difficult process. Has to do also with a psychic dimension, not just, liberating the land. It's not just about national independence. As we know, a lot of national independence were betrayed by local elite. It's an unfinished project because it has to do with dismantling the master house, dismantling racism, colonialism, and racial capitalism. So it's not just about adding text and adding artists. It's about reparation, and we will talk about reparation. And reparation are not just about money. Second, as museums are social, as I say, social bodies, they have also to do with their environment, which are changing, of course, historically. They are affected by wars, by looting, by neglect. They are sometimes built just to support a tyrannical regime. The more recent event has been the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. But also in 2020, huge mobilization across the world around Black Lives Matter, indigenous rights for the land, climate, people also, they are marching against the climate crisis, against police violence, feminicide, predation, extractivism. They were, life-affirming practices. But pandemic also meant greater inequalities. Millions of people will fall in extreme poverty very soon. And this will add to the increased precarity and vulnerability that the climate crisis is building. So for the museum, what does that mean? There are today, according to UNESCO, 144,000 museums in the world, of all kinds, some very small, very fragile, and other very big one, the one we talk about and we know. And where the most precarious one, the most fragile one, are in Africa and in the Middle East, and where a lot have closed and will never reopen. So even the discussion about digitalizing collection or making them accessible are just for the big museum of the North. It's not for everyone. So without that, what is the role of the museum in all this? Well, we have also so many refugees arriving and who are met by xenophobia, racism, fortress Europe, wars, militarization of borders and brutality and cruelty, like your Minister of Interior who suggested to send back people on their boat. So what will be the role of the museum? Is it just to protect the collection for the future? But what is the future? What future? David Teogoldberg in his book called Dread talked about, the futureless future, the sense of the future without future. So what do we do? He argued that you have two responses to that. One is fear, withdrawal, and more violence, and the other one is a call to action, affirming that there are alternatives to what we are, being said that is normal, against the normalization and banalization. It's also the role of, and what is the role of the museum in the larger debate on reparation today? And recently I co-curated with Kader Attia, with the artist Kader Attia. And by Utrecht, a school called La Colonie Nomade Fragment of Repair in Paris, the Nomad Colony. You know that Kader Attia, the artist, opened a place called La Colonie in Paris, but La Colonie, slash, I guess, which was closed because of the pandemic. So we are doing things, we call it Nomad Colony. And so with 20 artists and activists of color, and we ask what is repair? What would be to repair? But also what is irreparable? How do we think, about what is irreparable? What has been so damaged, so destroyed that it is, that we have to live with the loss, the irremediable loss that colonialism and capitalism and imperialism has brought. So what it is, and we discussed during that school, the need to multiply refuge and sanctuaries. We have to rest. And I talk about the right to rest, because when you talk about with refugee and migrant, they tell you about that they have never the time to rest. They are constantly fleeing on the run. And even when they sleep, they don't sleep fully because there's a stress. So this moment of you really can sleep fully is extremely important. A place where to dream also, where to imagine other future, the fact that there are alternatives, and when to foster ecology of care. So what will be the museum of the present as future, of this entangled temporality that slavery and colonialism have built, the fact that the past is not fully repaired. We are still living with the afterlife of slavery and racism, anti-blackness, with a present where we are seeing predation and destruction, and with a future that is already threatened by what's happening today. So this entangled temporality means that reparation cannot be think in the Western legal way. There is a damage and there is a compensation. No, because there is, this. So how, we think about that, how we think about transforming the museum as a site of, life-affirming practice and joy. So this is what I wanted to introduce now. There's some practice. These are practices I've developed since the Triennal, the Paris Triennal, which was curated by Rueil and Verge years ago, like 15 years ago, 20 years ago almost, I can't remember. And Rueil and Verge asked me, Françoise, what would we want to do? And I was already interested in museums, so I suggested, let me. So it's, decolonial artistic practice, how you foster political anti-racism. So political, not moral anti-racism, that racism and blackness is really what makes the world, what organizes the world today still. So I put a quote of Audre Lorde, when we speak we are afraid, our words will not be heard nor welcome, but when we are silent we are still afraid. So it's better to speak, remembering we were never meant to survive. So this, for me, it's the question of fear, which is a very potent tool of pacification and normalization and banalization. They're very, very strong and quite often underestimated. So decolonial methodology, I try to deploy, what will be, it's multidimensional thinking, or what we could call also intersectional thinking. That is what I see here. I have to learn to see again, I have to unlearn, so I learn again. What is this that I see, and how it's connected with other things? How I trace different threads that, that finally draw a cartography, multiple cartography in which you have the cultural, the economic, the question of gender, race, production, distribution, how this, which look like a banal, package of infection control solution, is connected with the chemical industry, with the plastic industry, with who are the people packing this together, how it's being sold, all this. So it's not just talking. So it's not a binary. It's also for me again the economy of lack, because there was this feeling very much. The West defined the rest of the world as lacking reason, lacking art, but also patriarchy of women lacking the fathers. And we are, a lot of people are lacking something to be complete. And so the feeling of lack has been really imposed and in fact informed the ideology of development for Africa, which was terrible mistake. In fact, was to impose Western way of thinking and Western technology. So how it defined, the West was defined the West as lack of culture, technology, and reason, and that we have to go against this idea of lack, to think that there is plenty of things. And when I work with, when I do workshop, is to start by saying, what do we know? What each of us here do we know? And language, memory, technique, what do we know? We know how to repair a bike, we know how to build a roof, what do we know? And then we discover that we know much more than we think in terms of really, not just here, but also manner of thinking. It's always collaborative and collective, looking at the multiplicity of sources and archive, looking at literature, poetry, photo, cartoon, songs, and I will develop that. And questioning the hegemonic narrative, who's being silenced, who's writing, and for whom. I mean, tell me who set up the archive, and I will tell you who's in power, how the archives are being set up, how they are indexed and presented. So fostering political is analyzing current form of racial capitalism, political dispossession, intersection of gender, race, and class as disciplining tool of white supremacy. To think also the question of representation, because there is a lot of talk about representation and borrowing from revolutionary pedagogy. Paulo Freire, Tagore, feminist pedagogy, indigenous pedagogy. When I say, the question of representation, we will discuss about that because there is a lot of, we focus on the representation and, how this has been, we have been, or women and people of color have been represented. And I question, to the extent to which representation is an important framework. Or is not, again, an imprisoning framework. And this is also, don't let the past steal your present. So all this, to think again into what are the temporalities through which we are thinking. So the first idea, I told you about this museum without object. So between 2004 and 2010, I was, invited to contribute to a team to build a museum in Réunion Island. And Réunion Island was without a native population when the French took possession in the 17th century. And then they brought Malagasy and East African as enslaved people, and also from other countries of the realms of the Indian Ocean. Also then indentured workers from South India, but also China and what is Mozambique today and Madagascar. And they were migrants later in 19th century coming from Gujarat or the south of China or all the place also. And of course settlers from France and also from Europe. So it was to show, it was about the history of the population. What was that? So there were many discussions. In European museum, the object tells you the story. There is that, and you can have the narrative. This was done by these people. This happened like that, this is used in ritual, or is used for this or that, or this painting represents that, it was done then, and so on. The object tells you the story. But how do you visualize the story and memory of the enslaved and indentured, the migrant who left no material object? And a lot left no material object, who died without sepulture, whose lives were made disposable. A lot of museums of slavery, in fact, show the tool of the slave, the slave regime, the chain, the instrument of torture, but nothing about the human being, the man, the woman, the child, the person who was angry, fell in love, was sad, was, angry, has idea of suicide. The humanity of the person is absolutely hidden behind the tool of enslavement. So it's, again, a form of erasure through the denunciation of enslavement. And so if there is no object to tell a story, how do we tell the story? And also the question, what does it mean to build a museum in the 21st century, which is a very European architecture of space, time, and form of display? Why? So this, this was the question. So this, it was, the official narrative, the French colonial narrative, that there was no native population, so there was no colonization, and the French gave birth to new people, to a new population. But I was also thinking, there was a lot of massacres of animals, and the famous dodo and the turtles. And so we could say that in fact, yes, there was a native population and it was massacred. If we look at animals also as in fact the native inhabitant of the island. And it was the first, of course, the first example of the way in which colonization will be, which means you do not have colonization without massacre. There is no possibility. Colonization is about killing, is about dispossession, is about extraction. And also, so what is the time and space that you choose when you do a museum? And we say no to the French temporality and spatiality. We say we were not born with European colonization because the people that the French, captured and bought as enslaved or took as indentured worker came from a very developed civilization and culture and country. As you know, the Indian Ocean had millenary encounter between Africa and Asia long before the European entered in the 15th century entered this ocean. You find China in the Kilwa Island. All the port along the east coast of Africa, we are connected with the port on the Gulf, the Gulf world today, and went down to India and up and even back up to China. So there was a circulation by the first, 2nd century because they have noticed that the monsoon takes you from the south to the north, from May to September, and September to May, it go until back. So the wind pushed the boat this way and back this way. So very early you had an encounter. So you will find travel diary of pilgrims, you will find a story of captain and sailors. So the Indian Ocean is not as shaped as the Atlantic. It's not about the Atlantic as the place of the Middle Passage. The Indian Ocean is also a place of encounter and exchange between Africa and Asia. So this, if we started from that, we will not, the French will arrive later on, Europe will remain as a periphery, entering the Indian Ocean, being hegemonic for a while, but nonetheless remaining on the periphery, was not, the center of the world. And so, again, this question of the object, what was the object, what will mean, and that the fact that it was lacking will not mean that it meant the, inferiority of everything. So without object, I suggested, okay, let's not look for the object. Let's not, let's not be obsessed with the object. Let's start with a story, with a narrative. So we could, for instance, find that in, let's say, in 1801, a woman is brought to a port near the coast of Mozambique as an enslaved. Where she's coming from, we can find. What was that place? What was the social organization in that part of Mozambique? What people were doing? So we can trace that social cultural world. What was the road that took her to the barracks where she was waiting for the slave ship? What was the kind of slave ship, we are being used? And arriving in Réunion, she's sold to that plantation. What was that plantation at the time? What were they doing? How it was organized? Through that, you can build, nonetheless. You can evoke the life. And using, non-fiction narrative, what Sadie Hartman has been doing, for instance, with So this is what we say, okay, let's use literary technique and style also, but also use, borrow from theater, from cinema, for morality, for, poetry, experimental writing, stage screenwriting, to create, an evocation of a life. So that will be, so there will be not the object, but all this that could trace the story of so many people whose life had been forgotten and erased. So we discussed the fact that even the architecture was important, because we say the museum is not just what is inside, it's also what is the architecture. And so you enter the museum, you should not be entering and wonder, oh my God, being you like almost entering like in a cathedral and be silent and wondering what, I mean, being absolutely impressed. No, it's a place where you can, you can enter. There was no absolute need to be silent and to walk like that, entering in. So there is, that was also a question we raised. We did not want, we wanted as less as air conditioning as possible, artificial light. This is an island, tropical island, so you've got a lot of winds and a lot of light. And since we will not want also authentic object either, because that was not the point. For instance, I was against the sacralization of objects like the Code Noir, which is a set of rules about the enslaved lives, saying what would be the punition that they would have and how much food they were allowed per day. It's a set of law. It's a legal book. It's not a sacred book. So you have the right to look at it and look, because if it's under a window and in the 17th century authentic thing, you still look at it as if this was a set. It's not. It's a set of rules made by men about women and men. So you have to understand what this article meant and what it was taken, and you can compare it to current one, legal proceeding. So this is, desacralizing also what has been sacralized, even in it. It's really everything that has been normalized, this is the way it was. No, this is the way it was decided. It was never the way. And when, for instance, I was told recently, oh, madam, at the time everyone was for slavery. I say, no, that's not true. The enslaved from the first day were against slavery. From the first day they revolted. From the first day they marooned. From the first day they killed their master, they killed themselves. There's no way, not everyone, no. When you say that everyone was, because you think of yourself as a universal, everyone. So to be careful about the constant normalization and banalization. So that was a building. That was also, for instance, you see, this is the kind of a dry grass around, and we wanted to plant trees. And the French state said, no, this is a natural protected environment. And we show archive of the 17th century say this was covered by forest, but the forest was destroyed by the settlers also for the boat, for building their house. So that's not true. There was nothing natural about that. It's fabricated. It's a fabricated, colonial fabricated landscape. But it has been transformed into a protected environment. Part of, the postcard that you show, part of the demonstration is even in the guide, tourist guide. And it was incredible because really we had testimony of very old people living in the neighborhood who say that, yes, when they grew up, there was water. I was, and some places where they could even swim. So it's a total fabricated, and even they burn it, regularly to keep that, to keep any tree from growing. So that was also interesting, the way, how the environment is totally, in fact, fabricated in tropical island, and what is shown as, for the tourist postcard, the famous sugarcane field, where you had forest there before. And where on the road went from the one plantation to the port. So nothing, everything, the way the island was shaped and the road it was for colonial economy. So it was also to show that there is no, it's not natural, it's been fabricated, even the environment, what is called nature. So that will be inside. This was, for instance, the gallery, we call this people Zamboutan culture, which means the pillar of culture. All the men and women who have kept knowledge, popular knowledge and practices. That was, we talk also a lot about when you enter, as I say, because at the beginning, when we started the project, I was discussing with women of very, very poor neighborhood, and I told them, what is the worst things happening to you every day? And I thought they would talk about employment or housing. They say, we are badly received everywhere we go, because we are poor and we are black. So when we arrive in the office, in city office or, whatever social services, we are made, to wait. We are, answered we have to wait for the answer. The answer are vague, we don't even know. We have, made 1 hour of bus to come, we have to take it back. The children are waiting at home, so we feel totally as we do not exist, we do not matter. And this was extremely important for me because this is a way, the kind of daily ritual of humiliation, of racial humiliation. It's not just about insulting people, it's that the daily small humiliation, ritual of humiliation that make you understand you do not matter. Your life doesn't matter. So we decided, okay, we have to be very careful about that. So it will not be also the kind of, like in the airport on the train, we go around like that, one by one. But we will have places where people could sit and discuss, okay, how we're going to visit the museum, what is available for children and so on. And for the impatient, the people who are like that, like me, we will have this little thing that, we can get down the ticket. But this will be the terrace because it's open already on the. So this, after I wanted to show some picture of effectively the incredible concentration of this small island of different things. So you have Catholicism, you have Islam, you have Malagasy, African rituals, you have really a mix of things, you have Hinduism, so that was really, but it was the second practice, because I had to move on, was, as I say, when I did in 2012 for the Triennal in Paris, and I did it, other place. So I suggested I said to Queen Raison, I want to talk about the slave in the Louvre. Because the Louvre is very important, as I say, it opened in 1793 to celebrate the end of monarchy, and the revolutionary wanted to open the Louvre for the people, and took the things from the aristocrat and the church, and said this belonged to the people, because this has been, accumulated on the back of the people. And the collection ended in 1848, after it's at the Musée d'Orsay, and these are to date are very important, because I say 1793 is 2 years at the beginning of the Asian Revolution, and just a year before the first abolition of slavery in the French colony. And 1848 is the definitive abolition of slavery in the French colony, because Napoleon established slavery in 1802. That was very too important. Of course, people at the Louvre say it does not matter to us, this date. Our date or art history date. I say that's fine, I understand, but these are very important. And so what happened at that moment where you have the collection of the Louvre? Because the 18th century is extremely important, the highest, greatest number of Africans were deported. 17th century is 30 to 40,000, 18th century is 70 to 90,000 Africans deported per year. So the age of the revolution, French, English, American, and the Enlightenment, are the moment when you have the highest number of Africans being deported. So how was slavery represented in European painting? How it was normalized, banalized, how the visual structure, social life. So this told me, you won't find anything about slavery in the Louvre because the painting, and it's true, because most of the representation of slavery will happen in 19th century with British abolitionism. But otherwise, before that, you do not have any really representation of slavery as per se. So I say, okay, let's look for the oldest European painting in which you have a bourgeois aristocrat man smoking a pipe. Or painting with sugar bowl, coffee pot, teapot, the enslaved, because this means that the project of slavery has entered the social and cultural life of Europe, has become banalized, and not only banalized, but it's important to be represented with that. So then it's become also tobacco is quite fast associated with masculinity in Europe. So a lot of men will represent themselves smoking, because there is a connection being made. So of course there is no slave represented in the Louvre, but slavery is present in the Louvre. That's what I wanted to say. All this, hidden relation between consumption, and condition of production, and you can say 18th century, this beginning of this movement, when consumption is disconnected from the condition of production. You don't ask yourself why you have sugar on your table and when you have tea and coffee. And since Europeans could not drink coffee without sugar, sugar was absolutely necessary. But also the city were transformed. You started to have cafe, you started to have tobacco shop, you started to have, whole social life was transformed. And sugar was very much gender, and tobacco also. So it also affected the way gender was normalized. Very few women in Europe did not smoke publicly before the second half of the 20th century. Otherwise, you were a loose woman or a revolutionary, which was. So this is the question of the taste of slavery. And also I was very struck because you do have painting of the plantation in the late 17th century, so sorry. It's by the end of 17th century you start to see all these objects of slavery. And you see the plantation, but you will, if you don't know, you will not understand that you are seeing a plantation, that you are seeing the place of site of slavery. So for instance, this is one of the oldest painting. It's in the Louvre of the man is 1726, but you have a little before that the Dutch painting. This is French painting, but the Dutch painting that I do not have the picture to show you. But this is, and this is for instance Franc, who was a Dutch man who went with Guillaume of Orange, who was the prince of Holland, when Brazil, the northeast of Brazil, was a Dutch colony. And this is a plantation, so for me it's how you represent a plantation as a very, you don't see what you should see. There are black people, they are dancing. Okay, black people in Brazil, that's normal, you do, and no. So it's also how the plantation become a pastoral. Really, it's very exotic. It's one of the first paintings where you see exotic plants also. And 20 of them were offered to Louis XIV, so that's why some of them are in the Louvre today. This is, this is a Dutch, with you see the man, he has lost the pipe, another one in the back is also smoking. So you do have a lot of this painting. This is not in the Louvre, but I wanted to show because, I could not find the one in the Louvre. But I wanted to show you how this was always connected, the gender, whiteness, and the product. So you see, she's drinking coffee, and the woman is bringing sugar, and she has the color of servitude. Me too, they have this color of servitude when they're on sale. And you will notice that they don't look at you, whereas at the beginning, quite quickly, the portrait where people are looking at the public, and they look at the master, because in fact their existence is through the white person. And so you have the dog, more important than the little boy. And these are two very, very rich people who were living in Nantes and engaged in slave trade. You see how she's dressed also with certainly silk from India. So there is also, some kind of, we could go on analyzing, and the parrot, all this. And here you have the books, and if you look at the books, but this is not very clear, but they are legal, also a book of law. So all this, they were very, very rich people. So, and then I was looking also how slavery was, the moment was erased, and abolition was always shown as a generous gesture by the West, and the already white savior complex. And this is a very famous painting that is constantly used in France. This is 1848. This guy, the French, is announcing the abolition of slavery, and you see the black people on their knees kissing, the white woman. And the woman is half naked. You have a white man with a black baby, and all this, and the flag, and this chain. So it's really, and here is the representative. So this is very, very also how through the representation of abolition, slavery as a regime of many centuries was erased. And so this is what I did. So the second practice I wanted to talk about, I still have some time, Sarah, or should I go faster?
No, there's plenty of time.
Okay. This is what I did between 2016 and 2018. I call l'atelier. This is not the atelier of the artist. It's the atelier in the sense of, the atelier of the craft people working together, collaborative space. There's people, you imitate, you work together. So it's not the person alone in some places. The genius. So this was, the idea for me was to bring together 20, 25 artists and activists and scholars of color and to talk, and so in 2 days we had to realize a performance. The principle was the lowest economy possible. So we will do with what we have. So for instance, for the performance we needed, I don't know, some kind of one, let's say a table, I'd say. Or do you have one, a round table? Do you have one at home? Oh, no, nobody has a round table. Okay, how can we replace it? So really not being stopped by what we don't have available, and we don't buy. If we have money, we buy drinks and food, so we can have, a party. But it's not about, so it's just to get used to work against this economy of lack, as I told you about, that the fact we have plenty to work from what we have. So in 2016 it was cartography of postcolonial space. 2017 dystopia, utopia, erotopia. This was about, so I was proposing an argument. So dystopia was the fact that 2/3 of humanity had been living in dystopia for centuries, not in utopia. And in the Western frame, the utopia always leads to dystopia. It ends very badly, right? You start very well and it ends badly. And so if we were reversing it and say, okay, we have been living in dystopia, what would be the utopian way of thinking? Or, like making the leap of imagination, to go. And the utopia. So, and war, piece of water, the last one, was about the fact that war is, we are living in a permanent state of war for decades now, and peace is a very short interlude between two wars. Europe has not been at war, as we say, as we noticed, but Europe has externalized its war elsewhere, so you have a lot of war. And peace is really something that, some men, white men say, okay, now we have to initiate peace, and then after there is a piece of paper being signed among men, but in fact war continue. So how do we rethink peace? How is, peace start to be again a very important thing, that we have to live in peace and not in war? And the question of water, because this was a moment where even giving a glass of water to a refugee was criminalized in France. So which is the basic human gesture that you have to do, that you can do. And also the connection with privatization of water, pollution of water. The question of we cannot live without water. A human being cannot live without water. We could not, for instance, for 3 days, no food, we can survive, but water. So this element and how this element has become, in fact, also a site of war. So these were different arguments, and from that, we invented a performance. So as I say, and today, and not an edition, so it was not a biennial. Here, the photographer, we were bringing all our talent together. So again, I'm guessing. So the objective was for the cartography of post-colonial space, it was, denationalizing the cartography, provincializing France, bringing to light circulation, itinerary, enforcing. And also avoiding the colonial model of juxtaposing image of object, or even, the supermarket form of exhibition. Little things for Martinique, a little thing for Guadeloupe, a little thing for New Caledonia, and a little thing for France. We did not want that. So I invited participants to bring an image, object, recipe book, anything that could, make them think of that cartography. And so that was the end, so that was an homage to the father of the member who had just died, so with a kind of offering that you do in Réunion. Below, it was a preparation of the performance, because by the second day, around 5 p.m., we invite the public. So that was something around the banana, because it was the beginning of the scandal of the chlordécone in the Antilles, where banana plantation has been, there was a pesticide, and now the entire island are polluted for generations. So there was a small library of book. This was black rice as connected with the memory of Vietnam, different things. So this is a public entering. So that was where the performance, and one of the things like the performance is just one time, and then it's done. It has to be ephemeris. It's not a spectacle. It's something that we do and disappear. The second one was dystopia, as I say, to counter that there is no alternative. And we started from the Maroon, those the enslaved who flee, and the question of the difficulty to get freedom and equality. So I suggested that we go to the forest, because most, usually the city as a site of the revolution of transformation, but the forest is a place of witches, spirits, Maroon, guerrilla fighters, fugitive. So we went to a real forest, not a park, a real forest near Paris, and then we sat and we discussed. So this is how we are, in the rail station. We're going to take the train. This is during our walk in the forest. Then this is when we were having lunch. We brought, everyone has brought food. And then we started the discussion. We had some rest or so. We had fun because we were just, was a hairdresser and the name was Atelier, so we thought, okay, that was our place. And the second day we went to the Seine and pay homage first to the Italian who had been drawn by the French police on October 17, 1961. And then to other memory. People were invited if they had memory, okay. And many, in fact, brought memory. And then we went to La Colonie, Barre, to write the Utopian Manifesto. And this is when we were near the Seine and we threw flowers to those who were drawn. And that's excerpt from the manifesto, it's too long, but it was really a call to imagine utopia, to give us energy, to dream, to dare to think outside what is presented as natural, pragmatic, reasonable, dream of endlessity and resistance, justice and freedom, happiness and kindness, friendship and wonderment. And we talk about the fact, that suddenly oppressor claim to be the victim, the end of history, and how this is, how even effectively everything is transformed into a commodity when decolonization is losing its meaning, it's appear on t-shirt and has no meaning. So how the Maroon, not Wi-Fi icon, but this question of freedom, of being on the move, in motion, of inventing new and free territory where it's important. And so claiming the right to be unfinished and contradictory, to redefine the visual trace of history, to explore the past, to analyze the present, imagine the future, and the utopia as a never achieved goal, a permanent state of curiosity. So nothing not, something that we be. So the last one, as I say, it was about peace and water and love, revolutionary love. So not what, as Baldwin has written, not the state of being or the state of growth, the infantile American sense of being made happy, but the tough and universal sense of grace and daring and growth. So we marched through Paris, we went to Père Lachaise with the big, and in the afternoon we met again in a big garden, and again we discussed what we'll be doing. But I suggested that we will have like 3 groups. One group will be the Cassandra, who warned about the forthcoming catastrophe and nobody listening to them. The second will be the Amazon, those who think that you have to prepare for war, because there is war, you have to become soldiers. And the third one will be the keeper of water, those who, this very fragile thing that is water. So each group went, and decided what they will do. We didn't do it together, all the three groups, but each group did it. This is when we were at Père Lachaise and we, against police violence, we had, And then we went to Chiasma, which was a cultural center, which was set up by Olivier Marbeuf, who was a friend and an artist. And the performance, these are the Amazon preparing themselves, to fight. And this is, that we have, and this is, so the public performance that the Cassandra, about, this were the Cassandra, the performance of the Cassandra, running on their boat shoes. And the keeper who flee wars and poverty, they are called migrants, but they are criminalized. And they reveal what is at stake behind the process of the uniting, Because they had brought this watermelon, they had, and we carried the water, so everything was really an expression of incredible fragility. And these were the Amazon, those who wanted really to, in fact, carry the torch and fight. But of course, if it's a war, you have dead people also. And water, that was at the end, the celebration of water. So I think I have two more. Another practice was at the Musée Delacroix around Orientalism. So Eugène Delacroix was one of the greatest painters. And we went to Morocco with the army, with the French army. So a lot of Orientalist painters and writers, in fact, were embedded in the colonial army. So I didn't want to approach that as, having a forgotten chapter. Oh, we have forgotten the chapter. But more that, in fact, we need to learn to see what is under our eyes, but that we don't see anymore. We no longer see because we have untrained our eyes. So, in fact, it was at Musée Delacroix, there was a room around a woman in Algeria in their apartment, and another room was around masculinity. But we make connection with TV series, film, and everything today. So it's alive, it's very alive. So it was not to say Delacroix should have done this or that, but how it was still, this representation of Muslim were still very strong. At the Musée de Real Malmaison, this is where Joséphine Barnet and Bonaparte lived. I was asked by the director to do something, and I say, well, if I do something in the Museum of Napoleon, I have to bring the Haitian revolutionary. There was a little tension, but I finally accepted it. You had association, this is Napoleon, who is the most revered person in France. And so you had an association called Les Amis de l'Empereur, the friend of the emperor, and they were not very happy with what was suggested. But we read letters of Toussaint Louverture, of Dessalines, of Roi Christophe, pieces of Aimé Césaire. We talk about the women who participated in the Haitian Revolution, and we also, of course, presented excerpts of Napoleon as a very racist person, absolutely pro-slavery. Which is always, put also, no, it was just a little mistake, but he has been also a great person. Because there was the bicentenary of his death recently. So there was, in fact, there was the big painting of David, very famous, of Bonaparte, and this is, you have here written Bonaparte, and this is says Hannibal and Caesar, because he think of himself as, along this way. The historical person. And on the other side, it was for us also to show, men on horse and how different they were, because this is Toussaint Louverture. And why he was called Louverture, because he was opening the way for victory during the Haitian Revolution. This is, so l'ouverture, the opening, to Saint the opener. And we call it Haitian Revolutionary invite themselves to the palace. And there were 3 black actors who came, invited to, and we had music, Haitian music, Guadeloupean music. What I wanted at first, in the first part, to reflect on the title of my talk, and then offering some practices. These practices are to say that we can do things in museums as they are. We do not have to ask them to repair their thing or to compensate for their, what they lack. We can start from their collection and make them say something else, that in fact is there, but nobody has seen. When I was told, for instance, in the Louvre that I was looking for men smoking in the late 17th century, at the beginning they did not understand the connection with slavery. Because they could not understand that tobacco was brought from the plantation and enslaved people in captivity. They did not make the connection. So it was this kind of connection that I wanted to make, that in fact you can tell a lot of story in the Louvre. You can look also in the decorative art, a lot of curves and anti-port of the 18th, 19th century. We have exotic landscape. We'll show that because it was important to have that in your home. It was part of that, your status, your social status. So the way in which the colony entered the daily life and became banalized, normalized, part of the things in which you drink your tea or coffee. And so you don't make the connection, you just become a decor, it's like that. So that I wanted, and my first part was about decolonizing the museum, which is in fact mobilizing people around the world, as you know. But what is it, what to do? In New York, you have this group Decolonize, this place, which say that in fact a lot of the museums are very problematic in terms of who is there, people giving money and involved into weapons that are used then against black people. So all this question how, as I say, the museum is a social body. It's not just outside of it because you have beautiful objects in it. It's part of the economy around and the way the world is. So it has to do with what's happening outside with the environment, and perhaps also the hostile environment, as one of the Prime Minister of UK said, building a hostile environment, and how museum can be part of this hostile environment. Hostile to poor people, hostile to homeless people, to migrants, to refugees, to sex workers, to many people, to black, to brown people who are not really that welcome. So the decolonization of the museum for me is part of the larger decolonization of the society and its economy. It's not just, as I say, hiding text or hiding artists, which is about justice, which should happen because it's justice. Well.